Well, joining me now, and I'm very pleased that he is joining me, is a gentleman that requires no introduction. So I'm not going to give him one, except to say that it's Brad Wall, who was Premier and the most popular Premier when he was Premier. And I expect at this stage, if we're looking at the more recent departures from that office, he's still the most popular. Brad Wall, welcome to this.
Well, I don't know about all of that, but it's great to be here with you, Rex.
Well, we've had in Canada a singular year. It's a singular year all over the world, but we're in Canada. You held the executive position. You were a premier, so you know things and how things are managed at levels different from people that are just in the citizenry. How has this pandemic been handled, and how difficult do you imagine it must be to try and handle it?
First of all, whatever challenges that I may have faced during my time in government, I cannot imagine the nature of a decision where a cabinet sits around, the premier at the lead, and decides to shut down an entire economy, decides to make it illegal for a small businesswoman to make her living and to pay her staff, decides that it's important that the government suspend the most basic civil liberties in the name of public welfare. And yet these premiers, our premiers, had to do that. And I had a chance to talk to Premier Moe, who was my successor, and to some of his senior team, who I also worked with. And I know it was so very, very difficult. They understood the magnitude of those decisions and what it meant for folks. And so I think all of us should approach this very question you've asked with some generosity, understanding that this was uncharted waters for all of them and decisions that none of them wanted to make. Having said that, I think some of the most successful examples of provincial response have been those that have sought to find a balance, not sacrifice public health, but to remember that this was and remains, as waves are predicted, about bending the curve, about preserving the healthcare system. Because, Rex, I felt that some of those who were wanting governments to respond differently than they were had moved off of that as the principal goal. That it wasn't no longer about bending the curve, it was nobody can get this. And that's a different thing altogether. So I think the provinces that were successful, and this is my bias, obviously, I'm a bit of a homer when it comes to Saskatchewan, but I think the government here struck a good balance between, the top priorities, healthcare, and I should say the public welfare and health of our citizens here in the province, but also a recognition of the devastation that was being visited on the creators of 80% of the jobs and the sustainers of 80% of the jobs are in our economy, and on mental health as well. And I'll just finish with this. I'm sorry I filibustered your very first question, but I'll just finish with this. The current phase that we're in is about, the focus on the vaccine and the deployment, as it is around the world. And Canada is, what are we now, 50 out of, on the list? It's abysmal. And this is not on the provinces. The provinces are waiting for the vaccine to deploy, and there is none. And I think, the federal government would have known. They've had a year, literally a year, to get ready for us to at least be as good as, let's say, the UK, if we can't be as good as Israel. And so I think, this particular federal government, Rex, in my view, as someone who still is a political nerd and likes to observe it, has got this, not just a Teflon coating, they walk around under a Teflon umbrella, all of them. And so whatever issues they get into, whatever mistakes are made, whatever scandals arise, they seem to, much like Mr. Magoo, they sort of walk through things and rocks fall towards them and never on them. And I think I hope the vaccine is a different issue. There ought to be an accountability around this issue with respect to this current federal government. As it lies, it's their responsibility.
Well, there's a whole lot there in what you say, and I'm going to pick up 3 or 4 points out of it, but one that might seem tangential. I think the economy is the biggest by far, but let's go to this first. Not the CARP, and I'm genuine, not the CARP, but at the beginning of this thing, for the first 2 months, out of Ottawa anyway, You had all of these other strange statements. First of all, it was the deadly reliance on the WHO as a genuinely neutral reporting agency. There was the thought that if you imposed lockdowns on travel from, say, China, that you would be, I'll be blunt, that this would be racist. That there was also some talk that this is probably not going to be a big thing in Canada. Now, again, it's easy in retrospect to throw rocks at people, but nonetheless, this extended over 2 months and even went to the point of saying, well, you know, masks are not only no good, they may be actually harmful. And then we get all this flipped around. Even with the unchallengeable nature of this thing, its singular nature, these errors were committed over time. There was time to correct them. And one of the reasons that Canada has had such a mortality is that the first 2 or 3 months, it seemed there was no compass, and I am speaking at the federal level. Is that a fair comment at this point?
Well, I think it is. And again, I also think the qualifier that, you know, nobody, it's pretty easy for all of us to hindsight this, but really, that governments must be measured by what they did and their response to things, and the things that they said that evoked a certain response from the citizenry of either to take caution or to not take caution when early days it might have helped more. So I do think there is an accountability there, but I think, you know, again, getting down to the politics of it, which is maybe unfair given the weight of this issue that we're talking about, but there will be a political consequence to this, I think, and it might be more about the vaccine deployment and rollout or lack thereof than it is about those early days. But when it seemed that all governments were, and even in chief medical officers, I think in many respects, and provinces and federally were challenged just because like this was quite obviously literally unprecedented, or I mean, unless you lived through the Spanish flu, I guess it was unprecedented.
There's another thing before I get to the economy. Again, we can accept, because it is singular. I keep saying the same word. We can accept that these conditions are not normal, that we have not seen them, and yet are we getting a little too accustomed, even if it's the rationale behind it or the motivation behind it is benign, to these exemplary decrees that, by the way, also keep changing about what you can and cannot do, and the enforcement officers that are let loose on people on the outside, the banning of certain religious observations, and the spotty way in which some of these fairly draconian decrees come out. We shrink the civil space in the face of the pandemic, but is there not a danger that you get too easily accustomed to accepting, without question, because it's medical, without questioning decrees from municipal or provincial or federal authorities, and thereby shrink the democracy?
I do have that. I have that concern. That concern remains that some of those basic civil liberties and inconsistencies in the application of closures and quarantines and lockdowns that you've noted are the kind of thing we might see again for lesser reasons than a pandemic. And maybe that's overly paranoid of me, but I think if we're worried about our civil liberties, perhaps a little bit of paranoia is not a bad thing, so that we might be vigilant, more vigilant about it. I do think there was an uneven approach to closures. You know, I give credit to Premier Kenney in Alberta, who, with the so-called second wave, although let's agree to call it the second wave, I guess, or I will. They moved to close. They moved again on closures of small businesses and large chain stores, box stores. Mm-hmm. They remained open in the name of essential service. I can understand that. But weeks later, I think it was weeks later, he reversed the position and said, you know, they made a mistake there because a lot of small business were providing the very same services / goods that those mm-hmm. large stores were, and yet they were closed. And so that, I think, is what you're referring to, because I think that sort of thing just didn't happen in Alberta. It happened everywhere in the early days of this pandemic. And I think that's pretty serious. If we don't learn that lesson, then to be very vigilant about an even-handed approach, then some people's liberties are more important than others. And man, that is a slippery slope.
Well, there's one more extension on that, and then I'll go to the other topic. The other thing that troubles me anyway is that the COVID, while it is quite the challenge, is also for some an opportunity, by which I mean that in the case of our federal administration, the operations of Parliament were deeply suspended and gutted. The accountability functions, the occasional, like we're doing here, Zoom Parliament, the national institution that is the king of all that we do in the biggest crisis we have ever seen has been in its weakest position since the Confederation. And even, you know, the announcements of all the funds that were being driven out, they come from the doorstep announcement. I can't remember a time when Parliament has been walked by so easily for so long. And that speaks of a certain casualness in the middle of a crisis. If anything is essential, surely it is the elected representative of the people discussing their biggest challenge.
100% agree. And that's been the case in a number of the provincial legislative assemblies, including in Saskatchewan, where they took measures to make sure they could socially distance during a session, putting up the plexiglass and dividers and arranging the seats and doing whatever they could do. But meeting in the legislature and providing the leadership for a province that you're asking, or a people that you're asking to do things that they've never been asked to do before, and they should be at work, go to work. I would say to the Prime Minister, not that he'd care what I'd have to say, but I'd say it's time to get out of the cottage. It's time to get back to work. Do so in a way that's safe, in a way that's consistent with what you're telling Canadians who are going back to work to do, but do it. There's an example in it. That's not unimportant. That might be the most important thing of it all. Is the example that you're setting. And by the way, by not going to work and taking questions in the front bench of the House of Commons, you're setting that sets a certain example and sends a certain message to. Right now, I mean, my sense is this, Rex, that there's great fatigue, of course, all over the world with lockdowns and shut-ins and quarantines. It's my sense that governments are right at the end of the capital they might have in terms of people's compliance. Yes. And this would be not just of those who were sort of from day one not interested in complying. This is sort of what I would call the previously compliant group, are really close to saying we've had enough. And so now that particular group is looking in on their federal government, and they're seeing that the Prime Minister is appearing by Zoom and wondering, well, if he can't go to work, if he's not prepared to set that example, then why should I listen to any more advice or restrictions or admonitions or rules from them about where I could travel and what I could do and where I could go? I just think they lose some license when they don't show up for work, when they may have a press conference every day outside a cottage somewhere and tell people how to live. I don't think that's acceptable.
Well, it goes even deeper than that, as the health challenge keeps saying, without precedent, or from the Spanish flu, but that was a different time. It's also the period in which, I'll go back, just not to score a point, but just to make the contrast. In the 2015 election, the one promise that was most underlined as being one that we're going to be extremely faithful to was that by 2019, even though we're going to do a $10 billion deficit each year, by 2019, we will be back with a balanced budget. Now, I know the COVID intruded, but it's 2021 now. We haven't had a budget at all for close to 2 years. Something like $400 billion that we know about has been dispensed without the accounting and without the questioning. The Auditor General can't get extra supplies to even keep up with what's going out. And that's the same period in which the Parliament has been eviscerated from all its major functions. Can you build up in a single year so vast a deficit and have a public debt well over $1 trillion and not be alarmed that whenever this damn thing lifts, we're going to be in a hard spot.
We're going to be in a very hard spot. And this is, again, to be fair, not just an occurrence or a reality for Canada. I mean, countries around the world have got, this is John Main.
Well, that would make it all even worse, because if we were just a singular case, but it's a global thing, so we can't anticipate good flowing into us. It's all over.
It's true. And so the whole country's really, the Western world's been, economic policy sort of been John Maynard Keynes on shore leave is what we're seeing, and there will be a day when we have to pay that back, and we have to get our finances back into good stead. And so I think it's fair to say, Rex, I mean, I was a bit cynical of the plan to balance the budget by 2019 anyway, from the Liberal government. It seemed to sort of be an afterthought. And so when it didn't happen pre-pandemic, I wasn't that surprised. I'm not sure Canadians were either. But so maybe if they weren't surprised, I hope that we all start caring more than I think we cared about fiscal probity at the federal and provincial level. Because I just sensed, even in my time in government, that it was falling in terms of the priority list of voters. Yeah. This issue of fiscal responsibility. It's like we have all had collective amnesia and we've forgotten the 1990s. Remember that when it was Chrétien and Martin that had to take decisions that were, first of all, very hard on provinces. There was a lot of downloading in terms of healthcare funding. But we had in the 80s, prior to the chickens coming home to roost in the 90s, we had every provincial government of every stripe running massive, unsustainable structural deficits. And you had it happening at the federal level. And it was irrespective of party there too, because it happened, I would say it started in earnest under Trudeau the Elder, but continued under the Conservatives. So that then the 90s come, and governments, again, of every stripe provincially and federally have to deal with the situation. It's like we've forgotten the pain that caused when we all went through the rebalancing. We went back to a point of some fiscal responsibility. And this is an order of magnitude. The numbers that have been piled up in the province from the federal, this is an order of magnitude greater than that. So I worry about it too.
So it's an order of magnitude. It is truly. I mean, I understand the meaning of it. It's exponential, but it is also occurring in strict counterpoint with the imposed impairment of the entire provincial and national economies. It was one thing to be doing all that stuff in the 80s and 90s when, inverted commas, things were supposedly normal. But we've had, as you've alluded to it already, the numbers of businesses, the industries like tourism, any major industry except the really big chains. Canadian economy has tied itself to several anchors during the period which it most accelerated its various obligations, provincial deficits and the federal deficit at a time of economic total stagnation. It's worse than it was in the 90s and 80s.
Agreed. I think, and whoever the government is over the next decade or so, federally I'm saying, but even in the provincial capitals as well, boy, the challenge there will be big unless it's decided by the people, by the governments, informed by maybe their electorates, like it seems to have been decided in the United States now for a good long period of time, that we're just going to keep kicking a can down the road, because that's really what's happened down there when you've had sort of more liberal presidency administrations budget basically the same way as the Trump administration didn't turn the corner in terms of its budgeting back to a more fiscally responsible state either. So it's not sustainable, but I'm not sure unless people start demanding it of their governments that they make this the priority, as they seem to do in the 90s. So we got to fix this. It might not get fixed.
Yeah, well, that's it. Here's another one that's on the same zone. While the pandemic gathers all our attention and certainly the focus of the news media, I mean, people have stopped watching television and reading those reports because they're so frequent and almost all embracing. But while this is going on, is there anybody charged with doing an inventory, keeping track, doing a count of how much small businesses, medium businesses, individual employees, do we know how much the economy is being hurt at the present time, or is that something also pushed off to the side? And when the great shout comes, then we'll have a look and everyone will be saying, my Lord, I didn't know it was like, who's planning, who's keeping track of it, and who's planning how to get out of it?
Well, on the former, I think the CFI, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, has been keeping track of it, and I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but I've seen them on different broadcasts and in different media and on social media, indicating how they trying to put a measure on the severity of the situation. And CFIB represents those small businesses that you're talking about. Haven't heard any governments. Well, I shouldn't say that. I've heard a real concern and caution for the small business sector from the governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and probably others. I just haven't heard them.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard it from the feds, and I am trying to follow that pretty carefully. You hear when they either, as they have today, extend some pandemic-related relief, or when they've been focused on small business relief. But in terms of marshaling the attention of Canadians to the amount of to the risk here, to the damage that has been done, and what it means, and quantifying it, I think the government should be helping groups like the CFIB do that, so that when as we come out of this thing, there will be that support from Canadians for that very sector, however that's manifested.
It will require great preparation. And again, going back, that's one of the great weaknesses, or one of the great problems agitated by the absence of normal parliamentary function in an extraordinary time. We're not getting, and I'm not being partisan, we're not getting national updates on the state of where we are. We're not even attending to the morale of the nation during this period. We have these vast unemployment numbers across the country. We have, as you keep saying, the small businesses. You have the tourist industries of every single province ripped to shreds. The transportation, Newfoundland just this week, WestJet said no more flights to St. John's. We need more than, as you say, the daily update on the COVID numbers. A parliament would be exposing the thoughts of all the parliamentarians to the state of the country, not only on its health front, but also on its economic front, so that when we do come to the second challenge, and it is coming, as you just stated, there would at least be some mental or attitudinal preparation. This seems altogether, to me, and it's personal, it's altogether too casual the way we're walking through this.
It's the right way to put it. It's a very casual approach, and it starts with the how of it, because what we get, to the extent there are still regular briefings at all, they are very narrow in terms of their focus on the case numbers, on COVID, on maybe a little bit on vaccines, but they don't talk a lot about that program either, because it ain't going very well. But there isn't this sort of general report on the state of things. Parliament is a good place for that. Parliament's the right place for it. But so are those morning briefings. If you even reduce them to once every 2 or 3 days, that's what the Prime Minister would also want to make a priority of. The COVID report, yes, but what about the Canada report? What about what's going on in the country, and what we might need to do down the road? What we might want to accept our government doing and support them in doing down the road to deal with the next shoe that drops.
I know that always between prime ministers and premiers, there's a natural and, in fact, a healthy tension. There should be in a confederation. But I recall, I'm an antique. I recall constitutional conferences. I remember when we were dancing around about the charter, the federal-provincial high summit meetings. I remember Peter Loughy, for example, sitting across from Pierre Trudeau in times past when we had really big issues to talk about. A lot of people said, these federal-provincial summits weren't very useful. Actually, they were. We saw all 10 or 11 or 12 or whatever the number would have been, and we saw them either in challenge or in consort. During this whole year, I mean, the Prime Minister and the premiers of the provinces and the territories, should there not be some sort of mechanism that every 3 or 4 months or even 2 or 3, they are in the same place, and they are telecasting, and they are speaking as both provincial and federal to the nation. There's a vacuum there, and again, as a former premier, you'd have an insight into whether that's a feasible thing or not.
Well, it's hard for me to comment specifically on the idea relative to a pandemic because I never faced anything like a pandemic. So, I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe someone might argue the other side of that, be a devil's advocate and say, well, do we really do the premiers and their teams around them need the distraction? There's a lot of planning that goes into those first ministers' meetings, as you can imagine. My understanding is they've been having regular phone calls. I shouldn't say regular. I don't know if they've been on specific intervals or not, but they've had some number of phone calls to discuss things. And I don't know. I mean, Harper's approach was, and he was prime minister for most of my time as premier. He didn't much care for first ministers' meetings unless it was a sort of a time of major import, kind of like we're in now. So maybe this goes for a suggestion, because he did have several. There was a series of them around the 2008, 2009 economic collapse. When he gathered us all together. And you know what, premiers, there wasn't a lot of drama and sort of infighting. Their premiers, we knew why we were there. And we also knew Canadians would put up with watching us sort of trot out our usual beefs with the federal government when we were meant to be gathered together to find solutions for the economic challenges in the country. So maybe I may help making that argument for the idea you suggested. But by and large, Harper preferred a bilateral approach, and I liked it better too, because meetings typically did lean in a little too much into the drama and to regions or provinces unable to, maybe I was probably guilty of it too, unable to ignore the temptation to make provincial federal politics out of something. Maybe it wouldn't have happened in a pandemic. I don't know. I do think the parliament itself and the prime minister reporting to the people, not just on COVID cases or even woeful vaccine deployment, but on the state of this dominion would be a good, and what we might all have to do together tomorrow
to get out of it.
This would be helpful.
Well, let's go to one that's very familiar. The other impact of the pandemic is that every other issue gets a cloak, or it's suffocated or pushed off the main agenda. When Mr. Biden was sworn in as president, he didn't let the clock run out for a single day before he canceled the Keystone pipeline, which has been in the works, and you know better than I, but since I was a child, canceled, uncanceled, canceled again. And yet the response from Ottawa, he had a little murmur about it. I can imagine the impact it would feel to the oil and gas industry. How can this country continue its obvious denigration of the oil and gas industry? And how can a decision by a president on his first day receive so little challenge back after we've worked so long and so hard to get the agreement out of Trump, and before that, Obama, of course, denied it? I mean, this is a big deal, but a bicycle on the street is bigger news.
And not to add to your not so rhetorical questions, but how is it that 48 hours later, it took him a day to kill the pipeline, true enough, and 48 hours later, not only is there's this sort of whimper and we're kind of disappointment, a comment from the prime minister, but also the federal government saying things like, "But we understood you can't pay now," and then the ambassador saying, "It's time for us to move on from this pipeline," in terms of a response to Premier Kenney and others in the country and the industry saying, "Well, we should probably still keep trying at this. This is an important project." And the answer from the federal government was, "It's really time to move on." Oh, really? It is. It's time to move on again from the oil and gas sector. That would be an oft-heard refrain from this particular federal government. And I saw about, I think it was 2 weeks after the permit is yanked by Biden, the Democratic senator for West Virginia, Joe Manchin, who's maybe the most powerful man in U.S. politics, and will be for the next 4 years, because he's one of those very increasingly rare blue dog Democrats that's known to vote with Republicans. And in the Senate, where we all understand the checks and balances of the U.S. system. The Senate votes as important as the president or the votes of the House of Representatives. And here you have Manchin, who's very much this blue dog Democrat that may be sort of the final linchpin in a lot of U.S. federal government policy or decisions. But back to what he said about Keystone. So our prime minister saying it's time to move on. We understood it was your Democratic campaign promise. Here's a Democratic senator saying, I'm not moving on. I'm going to go back to the president. I'm paraphrasing, of course.
Yeah.
This is a good senator, but I'm going to continue to work towards a reversal of the reversal. You know, you're right. It's a bit dizzying in terms of how many times it's been reversed. Yeah. But right now we need to reverse the reversal. And as long as, I mean, if it was in my old job as premier and I heard that there was a senior and pivotal and influential senator in the same party of the president that had just yanked the permit now saying publicly, well, I don't think we should give up yet. We wouldn't give up, and neither should the prime minister give up.
It's amazing. I wonder, again, that's why I said that COVID suffocates so many other issues. I was out in Alberta and in Manitoba and in Saskatchewan a fair bit the year or so before all of this came down upon us, and you could feel, and it's genuine, it's not a pretense, you could feel the either anxieties, the indifference, and in some cases, the estrangement of so many Canadian citizens from what they thought of was the central government, that somehow they weren't in the game, that their major industry, oil and gas, and then farming associated with that, just didn't seem to have the clearance that even smaller things over here. When Keystone gets canceled on the first day from a president that is friendly ideologically to the prime minister, and it receives so tepid a response, it's deeper than just the economic thing. I would think that the citizens in Alberta in particular would see this as another moment of high symbolism, that something that is so cardinal to them is so peripheral to everybody else.
Great way to put it. You know, and when Trump goes after Canadian aluminum or steel, the response from Trudeau is appropriately swift and commensurate. You know, I think it was an equal action, and I think the Americans took note of the fact that this threat of counter tariffs. Country of origin labeling issue was big when I was premier. That's this notion the Americans have of labeling meat from Canada and Mexico as it sits on the supermarket shelf. So we worked very hard with Jerry Ritz, the ag minister, and the prime minister, and Western provinces and others to work very hard to get that changed, to get that out of the U.S. Farm Bill. And finally, when the Americans would refuse they would ignore every WTO warning and all of our good efforts of outreach, finally it was Harper and Ritz that said, all right, well, here's the deal. You've lost the last WTO ruling, and if you don't change this country of origin labeling, we will slap tariffs on these very strategic products in terms of their provenance. They came from states that were swing states for an election. It was, I think, quite a brilliant way to respond, because it wasn't just sort of a blunt instrument response in terms of tariffs on well, you got our sector, we'll get yours. It was pretty strategic. Anyway, you had that example under Harper, and under Trudeau, you've got the example of a counter tariff on steel and aluminum. Where was that sort of response or determination in the face of this of the removal of Keystone? And he could have been signaling this well before the inauguration. We know that he talked to Biden before the inauguration, and we understand that in diplomacy, typically for presidents-elect, that doesn't happen, except that it does. I mean, you and I are not naive enough to think that doesn't happen, that you don't take the lame duck period between that second Tuesday in November and the inauguration to try to get a little business done before the president's the president and can keep these promises he's made that may be hurtful to your economy. Here's one other maybe twisted thought, though, that's related. The same motivations that Biden has to cut KXL, which would be in the name of climate change, are the same motivations that had him move against development exploration on federal lands. Be the same motivations that his administration, either through the EPA or some other arm of their administration, move against fossil fuel industry. What bothered me as premier, and even in my time since, was to see so many of our Canadian major investors still investing in the oil and gas industry, those that were, but in the Permian, in Texas, and in Oklahoma, and not in ours.
Yeah.
And partly because, and you can understand it, the regulatory environment for oil and gas that was friendlier down there under Trump, the investment climate was healthier under Trump's changes. Well, this is the twisted part. Biden is obviously pretty terrible for the Biden decision on Keystone is pretty terrible for the industry. But the same sort of motivations will move against his oil and gas sector and make our energy sector maybe a bit more attractive to invest in again. By comparison, it's sort of a Pyrrhic win. It's sort of like, well, now you know what we've been going through for the last little while, but maybe that investment will come here.
I won't keep you too much longer, but I got to have one more particular question. The carbon tax would fit into this whole thing about how Western region feels a little off the agenda from the Central. But I'd like to speak particularly about the carbon tax. I think is about the only tax that was brought in during a period of as we've stated, of near economic ruin, when all the businesses are closing, when every business has a tremendous challenge just to stay above water. We accelerate the carbon tax. How for just as a particular, how does that affect, say, farmers in Saskatchewan? And why in the name of, I was going to say something, why in the name of whatever is good, do you bring in such a measure during such a time as a pandemic?
Well, I do not understand that, Rex. I don't. And I also am frustrated when I hear the federal government, politicians, ministers stand up and say, well, farmers are exempt. Farmers are not exempt.
No.
Farmers, when they you've probably seen it actually, farmers will present conventional and social media their bills for natural gas, circling the carbon tax levy that will now grow significantly as a result of the increase in the tax that will happen, will march on here according to the federal government plan. So it costs them for that. Transportation it's an export exposed industry. That's something that farmers don't control, and export means transportation, and transportation means a carbon tax.
Means fuel, yeah.
And so input costs go up for farmers. For fertilizer, it takes natural gas to make fertilizer. There's a carbon tax. No exemption on the carbon tax for that. None for your grain dryer, where you're running natural gas to dry your grain. It is a huge cost to farmers, and it puts us at a significant disadvantage. And you know, the old thing I used to talk about, and probably people were sick of it, they might still be, was this issue of leakage of when you have a carbon tax in a jurisdiction close to one that doesn't have one, especially as we get into these higher levels, you get leakage, and what you're leaking are jobs. What you're leaking is prosperity and opportunity, and that's how we fund all those social programs we love in this country. Of course, they're funded on the basis of an economy, and so frustrating that the federal government, and increasingly, I think a number of Canadians are not. I shouldn't say that. They're not. I don't think Canadians are aware actually of, beyond the rebates that they might get as a family, what this tax visit on farming in particular, and on the oil and gas sector. I mean, that's obvious. I think you've canvassed it so well over the years too, Rex, and I would be remiss if I didn't say, you'll hate this, but I don't care what you hate. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you for your efforts on behalf of that particular sector. And it's not just in Western Canada, it's the offshore too. But think about this. China today, here we are a year, just a bit short of a year when, I guess, I always think the pandemic started in March. I get that it started sooner, but the shutdown started in March. China today is consuming more oil than they were before the pandemic hit. The International Energy Agency is revising its forecasts and is talking about continued growth. Because at first, you know, when the pandemic hit and the demand destruction occurred for fossil fuels, well, everyone was talking about peak oil again. We'll never get back to 100 million barrels. Yeah. Wrong. I mean, Elizabeth May, I think, declared oil dead along with the leader of the Separatist Party in Quebec. Wrong. You talked about the importance of the economic hurt that this pandemic has caused. We are home to a third of the world's oil reserves, this country. Yeah. And there is demand, and the demand is growing. And notwithstanding electric cars, for every electric car that someone buys in North America, the growing Chinese middle class and the Indian middle class are buying a gas car. There is demand. So if we had a federal government that viewed this particular sector that is as sustainable and responsible as any on the planet, more so, they would say, we could create some jobs. We could help with the pandemic recovery if we took a different view of that particular sector. That's where you didn't even, there was no segue to the rant, but
I'm very, very glad you stated matters as clearly. I'll tell you, I'll wrap it up. We're still into the territory of how people think of the oil and gas industry, but if you recall, and I don't think you should, first time I chatted with you was on cross-country checkup, and as I noted then, you were out snowmobiling and stopped the ride so that we could have a phone conversation. The reason I'm mentioning that now is that this week, the Minister of Industry, Mr. Seamus O'Regan, he has announced that there is now going to be production of electric charged snowmobiles, and that this would lead, serious, he said it, and this would be one of the things that will bring us to net zero emissions. So I want to know this, when are you going to buy your electric snowmobile?
They can have my gas-powered Polaris assault snowmobile when they can pry it from my cold bed. I was just saying, I saw the same tweet, and I think the company that's making it is Bombardier.
Yeah, they're in Quebec, yeah.
So I'm comforted by the fact that I likely own a small part of that whole electric snowmobile line as a taxpayer in the country.
Well, there's lots of charging stations in northern Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador. So, if you go into the woods, you can't stumble 2 feet without hitting a charging station.
I saw somebody post in Alberta. They posted the fact that they might get one of these electric snowmobiles, but they're going to get a trailer and a gas-powered generator to tow behind it.
Naturally. Premier Wall, it's a delight to chat with you. I'm very appreciative of the fact that you cut some time out for this. And I just say thank you very much.
Thank you. It's just great to see you again.